Really excited to share some work, some process, a little bit of behind the scenes of what went into a project that our studio did a couple of years ago in collaboration with a couple of partners. But maybe just to start off, a little bit about our studio. So we've been in business just over 5 years. We've grown to about 20 people. So our team is really kind of dedicated towards building brands. That's kind of our core of what we do. I think we've all probably had some weird life-changing experience over the last couple of years. It's been weird. One of the real nice benefits for us as a studio is it's allowed us to kind of rethink who and where our team is kind of located and how we're composed. So we've been able to really kind of go mostly remote. So we've got teams that are mostly based in Toronto. We've got some team members in Montreal, New York, and Paris. So it's been really nice for us to be able to give people the flexibility to live where they want to live and still kind of work together as a collaborative team. In terms of our partners, they're all over the world. So really get an opportunity to work with people who are, really being as ambitious as possible in their fields. The way that we talk about what we do and kind of how we've designed our team is we really help brands do three things. We do a lot of work with startups. So these could be companies that, could have as little as kind of like a good idea and they want to turn it into a brand, turn it into a business. So we do a lot of work helping companies at that early stage. We also do a lot of work with companies that we call our kind of scale up moments. So they might have had some success over the years. And I think a lot of times what we find is that their brands actually become a thing that hinders their growth as opposed to kind of supporting it. So we do a lot of work with companies that help them kind of retain what made them kind of special, help them kind of grow, and really get them ready for that next stage of growth as an organization. And we do a lot of work with companies that we call kind of a shake-up moment. So these are ones that might have been around for decades, in some cases close to a century. They may have lost some of the kind of cutting edgeness of kind of what allowed them to stay in business so long. So we do a lot of work with companies to help them understand what is the core of what they've been about for that century, hopefully set them up for the next century, and really do work that has a really long-term point of view in terms of how the creative should come across. To do all this, we've got kind of 5 internal rules that we follow, and essentially they're no walls. So we really try and make sure that we are breaking down walls as much as possible in terms of the creative output that we do. We don't go into projects with kind of preconceived notions of where they should fit. We really try and let the opportunity kind of open the potential on it. We like to say no clients. We obviously have people who kind of commission work from us, but really the way that we like to think about it is breaking down those barriers. We find the best work happens when there's not this kind of client-vendor relationship. We really try and break down those barriers and make sure that we're on the same team. Essentially, we're trying to build the same thing. One thing that sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but we really, hopefully you can kind of see it on the work on the right here, is we really try and embrace this idea of no style. So we don't have a house style. There's not a specific look that people come to us for. Really what we try and do is understand the opportunity, see the potential, kind of like where the open space is. And the analogy that we like to use is we want to be the best like studio musicians you've ever worked with. Like your brand should be kind of lead singer. We're here to make it sound as amazing as possible. The no end is a really important point for us. Really what we like to do is as a studio is think about identities and relationships that are designed to grow, to evolve over time. So if you think about typically, this whole industry really is based on brands that typically either need to start or kind of run their course. Really try and think about brands long-term and design them that they don't have an endpoint kind of baked into them. They actually are starting points for what they could become in the future. And the last one, no good, is, we're really trying to work with the most ambitious kind of people, partners in the world, and do work that's really great in the world. What we're going to be talking about today is a project that we did actually in collaboration with H&R Block. So this is their first kind of consumer banking platform. And it was a really great opportunity for us to think about how do we expand a brand that's literally been around for close to a century with H&R Block, one that's really well known, but also is one that has an entirely kind of new audience they can start to reach with this new product. In terms of the team that we got to work with, I was just mentioning to Chris before this, it's pretty rare that we are kind of solo on projects. We're typically working with teams, whether it's kind of internal teams, collaborative partners. So this one was a really great one. We got to work with the really talented team internally at H&R Block. We got to work with some super smart consultants at BCG Digital Ventures Group, now called X, and then our team. And I think, very early in the project, we realized like there was no real divisions. We had, a very collaborative process, and really kind of started to work together as one team. I won't kind of go through every single detail in this. We'll kind of cover the whole spectrum of kind of what we covered in the project. This is just like a quick snapshot. It's something that we do at the end of projects often, where we literally just make a board of all the work we kind of did that went into this. So these are, this is kind of representative of the various milestones that we have in projects, everything from kind of kickoff through to case study, and all the kind of work that goes on in between. So we'll kind of dive in a couple places. Probably won't do too much of a focus on kind of the end case study result, but really kind of the in between, how we got there. So a typical project for us kind of goes along this general spectrum. So we like to do a pretty kind of immersive kickoff phase. These are often they're very much kind of designed for the team that we're working with. So there are some projects where we've got decade-long relationships with partners, so we don't necessarily have to kind of start from zero, but it's really a moment for us to understand the potential, the concerns people have going into projects, and really kind of set up a shared ambition for what we want to do. We typically will do a strategy phase. The strategy phase for us, the way that we really like to think about it is it's a chance for us to collectively co-author what we think the creative brief should be. So really that's the way that we kind of look at the strategic moment of this, is how do we define what it is that we're trying to do? We often will do a brand architecture phase, not always, but this one had a pretty interesting kind of challenge about how do you integrate a new brand with a really well-known existing brand. We often will do a verbal identity phase. So this is really how do we think about the tone, the voice of the brand, and of course the visual design. So how do we really look at how this brand comes to life? Today we'll also look at a couple of ideas that we shared that did not make it through to the final cut, and kind of talk about the context around that. And then the last thing we do is really around building out toolkits. So akin to like a style guide, really the way that we like to think about these toolkits is it's almost like the tools and rules that go into building brands. We like to try and avoid brands that are overly rigid, ones that have to look the exact same over and over. Those are ones that we think are that can be a little bit brittle. They're not always ones that age elegantly. So how do we think about this as not something that is so fixed, but something that has a bit more open-ended quality to it, that really allows it to grow over time? So in terms of the kickoff, I'll give you like a really brief overview, but our kickoffs are really kind of focused around a couple of big questions. We often do these in group settings to make sure everyone is kind of aligned in terms of how we kind of talk about this. So questions that we often ask, and we'll often build out exercises of how do we get to these, but at the start of the project, we want to know what everyone's wildest dream is. Like if they think about the best possible outcome of this, how do we start to define that? It's always great to talk about biggest fears. So there are brands like the one we'll talk about today, Spruce, where they have, they've had forays into this category that maybe didn't work out the way they'd hoped. So there are, lingering fears potentially around it, but also, learnings that come from that. A question that maybe sounds a little bit flippant, but is actually quite sincere is who's going to care? Like, who are we doing this for? Another big question that we always like to ask at the start of a project is why now? You often don't need to build brands, like it's not a requirement. So it's really good for us to understand why our partners think that this is a really important moment for this company, this brand to exist or evolve. And then one other question that we always like to dive into in projects at the start is this kind of duality. We think about the reasons that people pick brands or pick products. There's definitely a logical component to it. Like you might be looking at different specs on a product or features for a bank. So there's certainly a logical component to it. But there's also a hugely emotional component to it. And I think this is one that we always want to make sure that we understand. What are the two sides of this argument? What are we trying to build? What do we want people to really know? And what do we want people to really feel as we start to build this brand? So this typically will take the shape of like a 90-minute kind of conversation in a group setting. Oftentimes we'll also do kind of breakout one-on-one sessions to kind of dive deeper into these and really tailor those based on people's unique position in the organization, what their expertise is, so we can really kind of dial it in and make sure that we understand from all the different perspectives what people need this brand to do. The next phase that we go into is really around strategy. So again, it's maybe a little bit different than a typical kind of positioning kind of document that you might see as you kind of work on these brands. The way that we like to think about strategy again is it's really about how do we collectively write the brief on this. So a lot of the work we do has to do with, our research, our understanding about it, looking at, the landscape that we're designing into, and really kind of encapsulating it typically into kind of like 5 key points that we want to hit as we start to build this brand. So the way that we often describe it is really thinking about design strategy as a bridge. So it's the thing essentially that takes us from these business objectives to design directives. All the brands that we do obviously want them to look really great, but we really want to make sure that they're strategically aligned. And that's the thing that kind of gives them that longevity. The way that we frame up this phase of work is we call insights and actions. So each one of our insights that we're building here is really based on kind of a vital theme that emerged in this research in our conversations. And we pair each one of those with an action. So this action is really a kind of a direction, a point of inspiration for the brand. It's essentially like what we have to do based on this insight. I'll take you through kind of the 5, kind of almost like a summary of kind of where we landed with some of the key insights on this one. But I think it'll help kind of frame up how we started to think about this problem. It might also just be like a slightly different way that that research is often presented. So the way that we kind of will often frame this up is we got typically anywhere between like 3 and 6 kind of key insights and again, actions that we kind of build off of this one. So one of our first ones in this context was, I think, a realization for all of us that, we look at traditionally a lot of like older generations, like you'd have a bank and you'd have it for life. It would often be the bank your parents had. There wasn't really a lot of switching around it. And what we found is it wasn't out of like love or loyalty that people weren't doing this, is because it sucked to change banks. Like it was a hassle. You had to make appointments. There was paperwork. It was like really, really hard. The thing that's really interesting is we start to look to younger generations, like those barriers are going away. Like people don't necessarily have that loyalty. The barriers to change are decreasing rapidly. So if you're an incumbent bank, this is probably a little bit worrying. If you are a new bank, this is great news and something that we can really kind of leverage as we start to think about the potential for this brand. And I think one of the other big realizations as we started to just think about the psychology of how people think about banks and what they are is, traditionally we think about banks as like a place that stores our money. It is a place that you kind of house it essentially. Increasingly, we're starting to think about banks as a tool to use money. So as we think about just the change in kind of perspective around this, it's a pretty significant change. And the idea of not necessarily needing like physical branches has really, really kind of taken off in the last 5 to 10 years. And also as we think about just the change like physically in a lot of things is like it used to might have like a limit of just like the physical constraints of a wallet. Like you used to have a certain number of cards you could put in there. Like those constraints are going away. Like you could have infinite number of kind of banks in your digital wallets. So a lot of these constraints of changing, of kind of adding have really kind of gone away recently. So one of our insights here is that essentially just the metaphor that wallets are getting bigger. This idea that they don't have the same constraints around it. You might have several banks that have like different kinds of kind of niche needs around them. So really what we need to do is kind of define a new space for ourselves and give people a reason, not necessarily to switch banks, but to add us to their portfolio. So, pretty common kind of like 2x2 grid here, but we kind of looked at what all, the competitive landscape was starting to look at. There's a lot of like slick kind of new banks that were coming in. A lot of times they would be derivative of kind of existing established brands. A ton of new challenger banks just because of the infrastructure that's being built around this. But really where we kind of saw our sweet spot is we had an established brand in H&R Block and one that's known for being pretty friendly. Like they're people that you go and speak to. So really in this kind of established friendly zone is where we saw the biggest potential, not only just in terms of white space, but also a really great fit for the brand that we were working with. So that was our first insight. Our second insight was really around this realization that, going back to some of the kind of core work that H&R Block does is that, at the end of the day, nobody wants to do taxes. Like it's not something that people kind of mark on their calendars looking forward to. They do want them done right and without pain. And we see a really kind of strong analogy with banks as well is like nobody's like excited to deal with their bank necessarily, but they do want to make the most of the money that they do have. When we started looking kind of, again, the kind of competitive landscape, everything was so kind of feature driven. These are all, very kind of like numerically based. They're all, it's all kind of the same stuff, like everywhere you look. So one of the things that we started to realize is that, it's not so much about just the features that we're listing. It's about what's it going to allow us to do? So I think one of the great kind of insights that the team brought was around this idea that it's about helping you create this thriving today and tomorrow. It's not necessarily about the features. It's about what the features allow you to do. So our insight around this one was that a bank is a means to an end. It's not like someone's doesn't want to just like collect banks. They want it to allow them to do something new. So we really need to make sure that we're designing our features and our brand around the ends as opposed to the means. And really this allowed us to think about, not necessarily thinking about branding a bank, but branding the purpose that we're trying to do. So a lot of the work that we had to do is thinking about, not what a bank should look like, but what should something that is about, creating equitable access, affordable financial services, inspiring confidence, easing financial burdens that is about today and tomorrow. It's really the purpose that we're trying to brand as opposed to the product that we're trying to brand. Our third insight in action is this kind of duality. When we look at a lot of the financial world, these two things are happening a lot. So either things are becoming kind of too complex and they become really confusing, intimidating, you don't really even know where to enter. On the flip side of it is sometimes things become too simple and that itself makes it confusing, or it's so simple that you're not actually kind of learning from what you're doing. So an example that we shared with the team is, there's kind of two sides of it. Is like if you were to read the entire TikTok terms of service, it would take you about 30 minutes to do it. So that is a side of like, it's so complex, no one's actually going to kind of go through that process. But if all it said as terms of service is like, don't do anything bad we're watching, that's also a little bit concerning as well. So trying to find the sweet spot of how do you provide information, not overwhelm them, but provide enough context that people feel confident about what they're doing. As we're designers, we're always kind of like on the lookout for things like this. And funnily enough, one of our favorite examples of kind of that sweet spot between these two is commercial type. I think they've recently updated this. I'm not sure if this is still there, but on their end user license agreement, they had this really nice thing where they had the full legal copy, but they'd have these kind of like little annotations just saying like what this paragraph means. So a great context where they're providing you all the information, but they're also giving you the context to help you understand what it is you're actually agreeing to. So when we tried to kind of find our sweet spot here is, things that are too complicated always would feel a little bit, overwhelming. They could feel difficult, overly dense. If we got too simple with the brand, it might start to feel, a bit abstract, maybe bland, a bit opaque. So really what we wanted to find a way to do is feel smart, feel honest, and also be really kind of cognizant of kind of the contextual cues that we're kind of building around. And really what we're trying to do here is build trust with the amount of information that we're providing. And also just kind of reminding ourselves like who we're designing for. So again, the team had done some really interesting work in terms of just defining the audiences here. And I think for us, the thing that was interesting is, again, it's not just a bank that we're doing. We're providing kind of a financial service. And at the end of the day, we don't just want people to have more money in their bank account. We want them to be smarter about money. So how do we actually set these people off on a great path for their financial lives? So our insight here is that simplicity is a sweet spot, and our action here is really this idea of smartening up. So how do we make people feel smarter? How do we leave people feeling more knowledgeable after this? It's not just about being easier. It's not about providing every piece of information possible, but how do we leave someone feeling smart? It was easy, and they feel better off financially at the end of it. Our fourth point was this realization that though we are adding one new product, it is like one new bank. When we look at the context of H&R Block and what they're trying to do, is that it's really this cool opportunity where they're expanding, the moments, the emotions, the interactions that they're having with their clients. So if you think about a typical kind of interaction with something like H&R Block, it might be like a once a year thing. It might be kind of like when you're doing taxes. Those are, it's one of the most important financial moments in most people's lives. It is often a very stressful moment for people's lives. They've done a great job of helping make it kind of easy, but it is, it's something where you might only see someone like once a year to do something like this. The thing that's really cool from brand perspective for a product like this is it's an everyday, probably multiple times a day brand. The thing that is, challenging with this is that it's not just a seasonal product anymore. It is one that is constantly with you. So how do we make sure that we're kind of dialing in the huge range of emotions that being with someone every day and across a lot of their financial interactions? How do we make sure that we are there in the right way, in the right kind of context? So again, as we think about these kind of financial journeys, like some financial stuff is awesome. Like you hit a savings goal, you go on a vacation. Some stuff sucks. Like you have a car, a car repair that you need to do, your credit score goes down. So we need to make sure that we are finding ways to help people along each moment in this journey. And I think, again, when we look at just the spectrum of what this brand opens up and what this new product opens up is, before the job we were trying to get done is the taxes. But when you start to really look at all the different pieces that encompass your financial life, it can be major life events. It can be, various financial pressures. It can be just like indulging in things. And so really when we think about all these different things and the different mental models that go along with finances, it really opens up just the emotional bandwidth that we have to deal with on something like this, and really being thoughtful about the context of how people might be feeling when we interact with them from a brand perspective. And I think when we looked at kind of the brand overall, one thing that was really interesting is H&R Block is, I think has one of the biggest retail footprints in North America, if not the world. And a lot of people deal with humans. So this is obviously, changing as people try different ways to kind of file taxes, but they've always had this ability to have humans who can understand how someone's feeling. They can read body language. If someone's stressed out, they can be empathetic towards it. If they've, got a huge return, they can be celebratory about it. So they have this ability to be empathetic in person. A lot of the work that we're doing with Spruce is it's in an app, it's in your phone. There's not necessarily people that you're dealing with. So we need to make sure that we've built in the tools and essentially the brand tools to be able to express all of that empathy in the app context itself. So one of the ways that we started to think about it was, just on a very basic level, there are positive messages that we will provide. There are neutral informational ones. There might be warnings that we have. And there might also be just like alerts, like a low balance or like overdraft. So really thinking about the different channels that we're communicating people with, from advertising to the website to social to like in the app, and understanding just the emotional bandwidth that each of these need to do, and how do we provide the right kind of design tools for each of these moments. So our insight here is that this is actually a new kind of relationship that we're building. So we need to make sure that we're engaging across the entire emotional spectrum. I think a lot of times brands, especially if they're designed in the context of marketing, they kind of strike one note, and it's often like, happy, optimistic, all good news, which is great on a marketing side. We want to inspire people. We want to, get people excited about it. When you start to really deal in terms of like products, like it becomes a much wider spectrum. So we want to make sure that we had the right tools. So it wasn't just, about a super happy, glossy marketing brand, but it really allowed them to kind of engage at a deeper level as well. And our fifth insight in action here is that we had this really interesting challenge, and something that we came into this project with, not necessarily a directive from the team, is how do we find a way to leverage H&R Block and not just leverage it in a way where it becomes recognizable, but how do we build a brand that actually reinforces and makes that mission that H&R Block has even more clear? And how do we also make it easier for our customers to achieve their goals? So we didn't know at the start of this of whether it was going to be like a master branded approach, whether it was going to be something that was totally distinct, more of an endorsed thing. So we really had a lot of work to do with the team to figure out how this brand was going to kind of connect with, but also create a little bit of distinction from that core H&R Block brand. So one of the big things that we realized, and this is just a bit of a summary, but there's a lot of work behind this, but at the end of the day, people don't care about business units. I think there is a tendency at a lot of big brands as they start to grow, is they start to essentially brand their business units. There are ways that the internal structures kind of exist. We wanted to make sure that we weren't thinking about this necessarily as the internal structures, but how do we think about this from an ecosystem perspective? How do we really help people understand that H&R Block is not just a bunch of siloed products, but it's actually an ecosystem that we're starting to build. So how do we go from a model that maybe looks something like this, that is like very siloed in terms of how you think about these, to actually something that has mission at its core and is much more of an ecosystem? And our hope here, of course, is that people do their taxes and it becomes a really clear entry point into something like Spruce, which might become a really great entry point into what they want to use for their small business. So again, it's really not about these kind of siloed expressions, but how do you build a brand that feels like all these things work together, and you're going to benefit from each of these pieces working together as well. So essentially, this became our new brief. This is the thing that we were kind of working across. So we know that wallets are getting bigger, so we have an opportunity here to define our new space, a new reason that people are going to kind of add us to that kind of portfolio of financial tools that they have. A bank is a means, not an end. So we're not necessarily celebrating that we have a new bank. What we are really trying to do here is brand the purpose, the thing that this bank is going to allow people to do. We know that simplicity has a sweet spot. We don't want to get overly complicated with our kind of financial jargon, but we don't want to get so simple that people aren't learning as well. So we want to really find a way to smarten up with the brand. This is a new kind of relationship that H&R Block is building with their partner, or their customers. And we want to make sure that we provide the tools to engage across the entire emotional spectrum. And at the end of the day, people don't really care about the business units. What we want to really find a way to do is design an ecosystem, make it feel seamless and purposeful in terms of how these brands all interact. So all that work kind of led us into the architecture phase, where we had a deep dive. We looked at a lot of different models. I'll give you kind of a brief summary of kind of where we landed. But as we started to look at this, really want to remind them this is about a strategic organization. It's not necessarily just about visualizing, again, products, but how these things kind of interact and how they connect. So we looked at, a lot of other examples. I think a lot of times with brand architecture, it's always really useful to look at how other organizations kind of organize their portfolio. And it really helps people, look at a brand, imagine like, oh yeah, it's like this, or it's like this. So we looked at a lot of different models. One that was around, an audience-centric model, different services, we call it reputation-based model, but one that really kind of leveraged the brand name and goodwill around it, or one that was really kind of master branded or brand-centric. We looked at, again, how the portfolio, both current state, future state, would start to kind of be represented across this. And with the team really landed on one that was around kind of building off of the reputation of H&R Block and helping people understand that this is a product that, you can know and trust because of who it's built from. So when we started to work through this, we also outlined what the implications were from the visual identity standpoint, as well as the verbal identity. And then also this idea of kind of customer impressions. So how do we want people to think about this? You can see here kind of code names, but at this point it was called Project Oz. So really helping people understand how we wanted people to kind of situate this brand in their mental model and how it related to H&R Block. So this became a bit of our model that we worked against in terms of how it would start to relate to H&R Block. So at the end of the day, really what we're trying to do is build a distinct brand that leveraged a lot of the iconic assets of H&R Block, but felt like something new and fresh. That led us into our verbal identity. So here, really what we're trying to do is establish the voice of the brand. I think, one thing that is always a bit challenging with voice is the content, the actual, things that they say is going to change all the time. It's going to be based on marketing campaigns, on new features. So really what we're trying to do here is not necessarily define the content of that speech, but how you say it. And I think, we've all had experiences in our lives where, it's not necessarily always about like the content of what someone says, it's the tone and how it's delivered. So a lot of this work has to do with the tone. How do we really kind of define that and make sure that we've got the modulations that really base, that can adapt to the different contexts we mentioned earlier. So the voice that we landed on after a lot of kind of like testing is one that felt kind of clear and conversational. At the end of the day, we wanted something that did not confuse people, but also had a warmth of humanity that felt very conversational. So the attributes that we really looked to build off of were ones that felt confident, direct, welcoming, and helpful. So this is something that I think made its way through to the design as well as the voice. A lot of the work that we do here is also around kind of testing different samples of language. I kind of kept most of those out, but the way that we kind of organized it was really based on, again, these different emotional contexts. So when we looked at that tone of voice from being kind of encouraging to enthusiastic, we understood that there's, again, this really wide emotional bandwidth. So you might be a little bit worried when you get a low fund alert. You might be annoyed if your credit score decreases. You might be confused when you're hitting the FAQ page. Welcome screen might be kind of neutral. You might be relieved about a bill reminder. You might be thankful when you're provided with courtesy overdraft. You got a savings increase. That might be like a thankful, happy moment. Credit score increases. That's super happy. Signing up might be like a really exciting moment because you're planning your financial future. So though that clear conversational tone of voice is true across all of these, this again goes back to that idea of that emotional bandwidth. These are all moments that we need to meet people at in a way that feels kind of true to the context. So again, a really important way for us to start to think about the language and how do we not just have that same like super happy, enthusiastic level the whole time, but we can kind of modulate that based on the context. The other big thing that we did in terms of the verbal identity was coming up with the name itself. So we had a lot of fun with this one. We did essentially like a couple of big naming workshops with the team. Our naming workshops are designed essentially to not come up with a name in the workshop, but to really help us understand the criteria that we think is going to make a really great name. If you guys are done naming, it's super hard. The analogy that we often use is, even on this call, I often had classes growing up where there was 5 Chris's in my class. You can't do that with a company. You can only have one of them. So it's a really hard thing to do. It's becoming increasingly hard just as there's so many companies, but it really becomes an opportunity for us to talk about how do we find something that is unique, that is true to us, and that we can really kind of own as part of the verbal identity. Where we landed in terms of kind of criteria for what we thought was going to make a great name is one that was memorable. So we really wanted something that felt short, familiar, and was easy to recall from the first time you heard it. Unmistakable. So then again, feels unique, simple, and also really kind of important that this is something that is, it's not difficult to spell or say. There's no kind of misinterpretations on that side. And then also something that is purpose inspired. So really taking inspiration, not necessarily of the bank, of the features, but something that felt, evocative and timeless. In our conversations, these are types of words that kind of came up that we were trying to kind of capture here. So, when we're looking for names, there's always a spectrum that we're trying to hit. So on this one, it was really about leaning more towards timeless, more simple, a little evocative. So we didn't want to have a name that was like purely like sounded like a bank. But then also when we got to the bottom around being, serious or fun, calm or energetic, these are ones that were kind of open-ended. I think there was a realization that, we could have maybe a more serious name, but maybe have a more fun identity, or vice versa. This is an analogy that we often use, to that regard is the name isn't everything. It's really how the name interacts with the design. So you can have a name that is like about as boring as descriptive as you can get, something like International Business Machines. You pair that with really playful design. It's a super great brand. Apple is like kind of a goofy name. It's playful. It's, it doesn't necessarily make sense in that category, but you pair that with really elegant design, it's great as well. So it's not about necessarily being all on one side or all on the other. It's about how those two things interact. I won't share all the names that we went through, but I will share kind of the way that we shared the name Spruce. The way that we typically work on this one is we start with usually a name of around like 10 to 15 names on our long list of ones that we think have high potential. What we'll do from there is we'll typically do kind of a ranked voting to see what names the team is most excited about. There's a whole legal process that goes through to kind of get clearance on it. We typically do some refinement on that. But the way that we like to introduce the names is outside of the context of design. This is something that we really just think about from like a verbal side. So we typically start with some kind of a very brief kind of teaser, kind of intro into the name. So in this case, we looked at a name that was about something that is always growing year round. So the name here was Spruce. So if you think of kind of an evergreen tree, it is one that doesn't shed its leaves. It is one that is always green. And, obviously H&R Block has a real ownership over that kind of color green in the space. So again, it was a way that we could almost kind of leverage that greenness in a new way that they hadn't done before. And again, showing how that could live with the brand. So Spruce, grow with H&R Block, a way that language can start to connect. And then we also like to think about how people will use this word in language. I think one of the things that's always challenging about names is, you want something that's unique. You want something that, visually has potential, but you also want something that doesn't feel stupid to say it. So we always try to say the names in a lot of different contexts. So you might say something like, "Hi, I'm Chris. Welcome to Spruce. I just opened a new account with Spruce. Would you like to get a refund deposited early with Spruce?" So trying to think about the types of ways that this word might fit into language. It's a great test for us to make sure that the name, doesn't sound goofy. People don't feel embarrassed saying it, but it feels kind of natural as part of the language. We also do a bit of an assessment on this. So, reasons why we like it. So, there is a nice meaning of like the evergreen tree, that connection. Also just in language, like spruce something up. It's a way to like, you're getting stuff organized. It's short and easy. It's connected to that brand color. And then, some names we might flag potential risk. This one, didn't really have any risk at this point. And then we also look at, how we might associate it with like a URL, social handles, and what a tagline or kind of endorsement line might be with this as well. And then we do, again, a bit of an analysis of kind of where it sits across some of those criteria that we looked at, just so everyone can see, that criteria we set up is really true to kind of where we landed. And one of the things that I think is so important with naming is the establishment of that criteria. You're going to come up with a lot of different names as you're building brands. Being able to find what is the right one is really hard. And the more you can have it as strategic conversation, as opposed to just like, I like it, I don't like it, can really help get consensus, especially with larger teams. So this was our kind of long list of names. So these are all ones that, at some point had equal consideration. Everything from Spring Green to Hank, which was a reference back to the founder, rhymes with bank, to Rally, Spruce, Kite, Vault, Upright, Ratio, Monet, kind of a play on money, Tilt, Neon, Draw. So these were all, at one point, kind of equal consideration, looking at the criteria and also just kind of working with the team. Again, we did kind of like a ranked voting, and you can kind of see kind of where these sit with the team. So it was really interesting for us just to see, you know, there was a lot of love for Spruce. I think, again, the logical side of the brain, it made a lot of sense, but also the emotional side, it really connected with a lot of the values that they wanted to hit on. So went through a legal process, got all cleared, and we were able to kind of jump into the design phase on this. And in terms of the visuals, really the way that we like to think about this phase is we kind of split it up into two primary moments. There's a design concept phase, which is really about exploring and not perfecting. It's about kind of testing ideas, you know, trying to visualize things that we heard throughout our research phases. One thing to note as well is the way that our team is structured is there's not a research department, there's not a strategy department, there's not a design department. It's the same people who are working on the project from start to end. So this is really a chance for us to, you know, things that we might have heard in that first kickoff meeting, we can start to visualize through the kind of act of design. Once we're going to get through that first phase, we obviously there's like a moment where we discuss, we kind of like weigh the pros and cons and get consensus about a direction to move forward on, refine it, and then go into a toolkitting phase. The other thing that we always like to do when we start these design kind of concept phases is a bit of a I'd say like reminder of like what the context that we're working in. So this is a moment to just kind of remind ourselves, like, this is what the landscape looks like. This is kind of like what we're designing against. One thing we also had a lot of conversations about was green. It is a color that H&R Block has used for a long time, but green and money are kind of synonymous. So there's a lot of greens in this space. So how do we make sure we find kind of our own ownable space within it? And also just understanding these need to work in really small moments as well. So, you know, everything from a billboard all the way down to like a small social app. How do we make sure that we've got brands that kind of have enough visual tools that they can be leveraged across all those different moments? And another kind of reminder of just where the H&R Block brand was sitting at that time. So everything from, you know, logo, color, typography, illustration. This is a brand that we wanted to have, you know, again, distinct, but also seamlessly connected to H&R Block. So if someone did their tax return, you know, recommended something like the Spruce brand, it felt connected. It didn't feel like two totally separate things. They could see kind of the connection between these two. So with that, we went into kind of three totally different kind of territories. I'll take you through those and kind of talk about you know, the one we landed on and why it was the one that we went forward with. So our first one was really about leaning into this idea of kind of radical simplicity. How do we kind of strip away everything that's kind of like in the way of helping just people kind of move forward with their financial lives? So each one of these started with a bit of a prompt. So in this case, it was, what if we embrace the boldness and urgency of the vision? A lot of the people that we're kind of designing this bank for, you know, like they need support financially. So they need to find a way that this is not just like another nice to have, like this is something that could potentially change their lives. So how do we make sure that that urgency is really going to capture it in here in a way that feels bold and direct? So again, really kind of leaning into these kind of tones of being confident, direct, bold, and purposeful. With this one, what we did is actually built off of the Square, the H&R Block brand. So this was about, you know, how do we, you know, connect that Spruce name? So obviously a bit of a kind of tree here, that upward arrow, but it's all based on the foundation of that square that is so synonymous with H&R Block. So this one is really about, you know, radical simplicity. Is like, if you heard the name Spruce, you saw this would all kind of connect together. A much more vibrant shade of green. And what we're doing here is actually taking the H&R Block typeface graphic, and instead of just using it in kind of a more kind of upper and lowercase tone, is this one we're just going to go super bold, really direct. So it was really just black, white, this bright green, and a much more bolder weight of the typeface that they were already using. So again, you kind of see the comparison here. So it's essentially the same typeface, just used in a different way. So again, trying to build those connections between the two brands. So again, how do we kind of get to that radical simplicity? So Spruce by H&R Block, you know, a little bit kind of drawing people in, a little bit kind of cryptic to get people kind of interested in the brand. You know, even just getting super basic. So like money grows on trees by H&R Block. So again, how do we get a little bit kind of creative in terms of how these symbols can start to work? And again, you start to see how we can start to bring in photography, you know, really kind of clean typography and kind of bring in this kind of like upward trajectory. Obviously a lot of work that we do at the design concept phases, we're kind of pulling, you know, found photography, reference photography. So a lot of this is just to give us tone before we go into kind of commissioning and building out kind of unique photography or illustrations for the brand. This is what an idea of what your kind of mailer would look like if you were kind of sent this package. So as you kind of open it up, really kind of bold, direct, and really kind of bright and vibrant. Again, showing everything from kind of debit cards. Really what we like to do in this kind of design concept phase is to show the potential around the brands, but also show the flexibility of how they can start to live, and really use mockups as a tool to help people understand the context of where these will start to live. So everything from in-app moments. So this is, it could be a really kind of bold, vibrant moment kind of in the app itself. What a social grid could start to look like. So again, super bold, really kind of leveraging just these really basic clean graphic tools. Oftentimes we'll do kind of motion sketches just to give a sense of how the brand can start to move in the real world as well. And then always kind of zoom back out. So those kind of contexts that we laid about, how do you stand out in this really simple context, showing our brand next again to all the different kind of apps that live out there. And also showing our brand in the context of all the other kind of competitors here. So it's always a good test for us to not only just look at the world we're creating, but zoom back out and show the world, the broad world that's going to live in. And we always kind of end with a summary of kind of what are some of the key visual moves that we're making. So that was our first one about kind of radical simplicity. The second one was really about using technology to create a more humane experience. So how do we really lean into that kind of empathetic side of the brand, and really trying to find a way to kind of translate that into the brand. So in this one, we actually introduced a new typeface, one that was much more kind of based on almost like storybook kind of typography. It felt more conversational, and then pairing that with much more kind of hand-drawn elements. So this one, we went with a much kind of deeper, like evergreen kind of green, and then pairing that with a super vibrant kind of almost lime green. So building on this, it's still all in the world of green, but it almost kind of splits the difference between the mid green that H&R Block has, and we're kind of going on the two ends of the spectrum. This one, we looked at, an icon language that was much more, still simple, but much more kind of hand-drawn, to really kind of, again, kind of bring that human touch and almost like take away the slickness that I think we often associate with these kind of neobanks. I looked at some fun stuff with, even cards. You can do some cool stuff with kind of like translucent materials here. So it almost just feels like you're holding one of these illustrations. And also to kind of look at the flexibility of this. So, the ability for people to kind of pick a card, pick an icon that represents kind of what they wanted to have in their wallet. In this one, we're pairing graphic, which again is that brand typeface, with something like a more kind of serif typeface. The thing that was really interesting for us is this allowed us to kind of split more conversational kind of typography from much more kind of functional typography. So we had a bit of a split in terms of what those two things allowed us to do. So as we start to look at kind of, the depth we kind of go here from just really simple typography to more headline driven to more kind of dense informational. So again, you can start to see how this one really leans into something that's much more kind of human based. It doesn't feel like a tech platform, and really kind of leaning into kind of a bit more of that hand-drawn, conversational, a bit looser in terms of how these pieces all start to work together, and really kind of putting people at the front of this. It is about portraiture. It's about helping understand the people that this will serve. So everything from your kind of mailer to the app itself, everything had a bit more of kind of this much more kind of humane touch to it. Looking at what the app interface itself could start to look like, all the way down to like a social grid of really kind of leaning into kind of this portraiture, this warmth around it. And again, really leaning into a much more kind of diverse color palette on this one. Again, how these things start to move, again, a little bit kind of choppier, sketchier. And again, that zoom out of how we can start to live here. I think the thing that was interesting about here is this dark green was kind of a new space that we could potentially own as a color palette. And again, kind of looking at how this could live in the context of these other bank brands. And then again, a zoom out of like, what are the big moves that we're making here? Then our third one was really about leaning into a bit more kind of a future centric one. So this one was really about creating a feature that our customers have been waiting for, but trying to do it today. So this one was really, again, about almost like inverting that color. How do we like go super bright and vibrant? We had this one kind of move typographically where the logo is always going to be just placed on its side. So it's always going to be facing upwards. And again, kind of pairing these two typefaces together. In this case, we're, again, using kind of reference illustration to kind of get a sense of what we're trying to do here, but really kind of clean, simple illustrations, bold colors, in a way that we could kind of really lean into the vibrancy around this brand. So it felt, in comparison to the other ones, this one was much more kind of slick, maybe a little more kind of tech focused as a brand. But again, also trying to find ways we can be kind of playful with these different pieces. Also just being super kind of clean with how we start to block these out. And again, this one kind of move of just the big kind of type kind of always in this like upward trajectory. One thing that was kind of funny is this idea did not make it through. The idea of a logo being a little bit too big for the card on the right here is actually one that made it all the way through to kind of the final execution as well. One thing we also want to play with here is this idea of like really customizing your card. So could you have a card that, you know, you had like thousands of different kind of avatars you could pick from, customize it, so that card really became your own. What a mailer could start to look like, as well as, again, kind of showing in context how these apps could start to look. So everything from kind of the app interface, you know, really leaning to the clean kind of bold typography, these really kind of distinct color blocking moments, and also really kind of illustration heavy. So a glance at what this would start to look like, you know, on more of a social grid, you know, Instagram stories, and also how this would kind of stand out relative to the competitive set. So even just that small move of like rotating the type 90 degrees gave us this like, you know, it felt like an always kind of like rising trajectory. And again, how this would sit relative to the competitive landscape and the zoom out look on the whole brand. So when we started to look at this, you know, as a set, you know, three really different approaches. One that was about this radical simplicity, one that was about, you know, leaning into that more kind of empathetic human side of it, and one that was really about a bit more kind of a tech forward feel. How these three kind of compared, and then what the overall kind of look was across these three different moves. We landed with the middle one. So I think for us, it was really interesting. You know, we liked kind of how different the app icon started to feel. It gave a dimension and really kind of leaned into that like emotional bandwidth that we wanted to hit on. I really like the use of humanity in this one. Things that we didn't quite nail on this kind of first round was, you know, trying to find that connection back to H&R Block, you know, build in a bit more kind of monetary cues so it wasn't so abstract, and really needed, you know, a really vibrant, crisp illustration style. I think this one felt too sketchy, and really making sure that our images provided context around this. So we took this feedback and really started to kind of build out the toolkit around this. Again, the way that we think about Toolkit is it's a tool to design growth. So really what we're trying to do is not limit what the brand can do, but create a starting point that opens up potential around it. And the way that we started to kind of build out this toolkit was really thinking about kind of three key kind of pieces in the brand. So whether it be kind of around awareness, so when we're trying to stand out essentially from the competition, the experience, so how do we kind of expand that emotional range, and then also really functional things. So we want to make sure that, you know, essentially the brand doesn't get in the way of being really intuitive. And also what we proposed here was actually starting to integrate shared elements from the H&R Block's user experience cues. So there are certain elements that are really kind of shared across both these brands to make it as intuitive as possible. So our brand tools, our refined logo in here. So we did a lot of work to kind of customize this one and really kind of make it, you know, unique, you know, some nice round edges, but still feels kind of crisp and contemporary. And of course, a lot of testing just across different sizing to make sure that you know, all the letter spacing, all the kind of moves that we're making held up at really small scales as well as really big scales. And then also looking at how we can start to endorse it. So how that lockup with H&R Block works as an attribution across the brand. We also started to build out a lot of different grids to make sure this was really scalable. So across different proportions, different sizes. And then also getting a little bit more clear about how we were starting to differentiate when we were going to use each piece of the type. So whether it was more for conversational moments, or more for information. So it gave us a really clear guidance in terms of how to pair content with the design language. So as we started thinking about the type styles across these, our awareness. So if we're doing more kind of campaign work, what that style could look like, our experience kind of in the app, that pairing of more conversational moments, more kind of functional moments. And then as we're getting to like really functional stuff, we really kind of get more into the kind of the graphic side of it, and move away from the more kind of conversational tone. This is also true across the color. So we've got our awareness palette, an experience palette, and a functional palette. The thing that was really great for us is it gives us, you know, the ability to stand out in terms of just the colors. It gives us a wider range in terms of making sure that experience has that emotional bandwidth and doesn't feel monolithic. And those functional colors are ones that should leave no room for interpretation. They need to be super clear. These are UI alerts. And they're also colors that we start to share across our H&R Block brand and the Spruce brand. So what those colors start to look like, and then also just kind of a comparison of these two color sets. So they feel related. There's actually colors you'll see across both of them. So really trying to find a way that we could bridge these worlds, but also kind of create a new space for Spruce. We also do a lot of work, you know, just making sure we've got our accessible color pairings, and then really start to build out this illustration style. So you can see kind of the trajectory of kind of where we started with where we start to end up. So something that, again, felt more crisp, but still had a little of that kind of human, a little kind of sketchy quality. Instead of the kind of sketchiness of the pencil, this had a bit more of kind of a collage cutout kind of feel to it. So as you start to think about kind of the awareness to the experience, again, we can start to build in more color palettes and really start to kind of leverage all the different pieces within the brand here. And as we got into the icons, what we proposed is actually not developing a whole new set of icons, is actually just using the ones from H&R Block. Let this be a really intuitive piece that is true across both brands, so that if you're getting certain functional pieces, they should be part of a consistent experience across the entire portfolio. So you can start to see how this illustration language lives across those three big tiers. And then also on photography, so things around our awareness level of photography, bringing in more context, the experience, kind of helping people really see their day-to-day lives in this. And then also the functional side was really not about photography. This is really about how do we raise awareness around the brand and help people understand the day-to-day experience around it. Then all this started to get more and more kind of detailed as we started to work through the guidelines on this one, how these pieces would all start to work together, how they would scale across different proportions, different sizes. And really starting to look at that core toolkit that we're really starting to produce. So when we start to see all these in use, one of the big moments we wanted to see was actually on the H&R Block site. So this is part of your tax refund process, where they recommend if you use Spruce, you get a refund faster. So again, you can start to see it feels like it's by H&R Block, but it feels like something new and different in here as well. So really, again, trying to find these moments where you can start to see the continuity of the experience. Again, working with the team at H&R Block to really build out the website, how this will start to live, and even things like the emails you get. So how do we start to kind of build out a really robust palette of different ways that this can start to live in these these really important moments like email communications. Again, how this starts to work across things like the app, your digital card, and then even really important things like how it starts to look in the app store. How do we start to bridge together the worlds of the actual app UI with the brand as well, so it feels stylized, but not in a way that feels kind of confusing or disingenuous of the actual experience. But you can really start to see kind of the emotional bandwidth start to play across from these intro moments to these super exciting kind of illustrative moments to more kind of clear functional moments. Where we landed with final card, so you can see that kind of cropped off kind of spruce on either side. And the thing that's really nice too is just the two-sided, the edges is super bright green. So the kind of full brand kind of gets encapsulated in that one kind of moment. A kind of snapshot of kind of how this all lives together on things like the social grid. So you can start to see, again, all these pieces starting to work together. And then what that overall kind of toolkit starts to look like. As you're going to build this out and kind of build a case study around this, really starting to show how these pieces all start to work, in animation, in movement. I think the way things move goes a long way to making it fun, making it serious. So really trying to find ways that we can kind of bring these moments to life through the movement as well. And it's always really helpful for us to kind of take these zoom out views and see, from the app to the card to the experience, making sure we've got a really continuous experience across all these moments. It's super fun, just build little kind of looped animations around these different icons. Again, showing how these pieces start to work in context from the card to the app. Small notifications, like how the real life experience of this brand really starts to come to life. And yeah, for us, it's always fun when you start to see brands like this in the real world starting to show how they fit into the life of the people that we're really trying to serve in a way that feels kind of natural. It doesn't feel overly forced. Just kind of fun to show this in real world context. So that's the Spruce brand. A really robust project with a really great team, and one that allowed us to really kind of touch every aspect of the brand, from the core strategy to the architecture of how it relates to the H&R Block brand, to the verbal identity, to what the brand is actually called, all the way down to the final app icon, the card, the mailer that it comes in, and really looking at how do we create an experience that captures a full emotional bandwidth of the highs and lows of dealing with money every day.